Okay, so where are we at? We've got the panorama dominating the urban landscape all across the world. Well, not across the world, but across Britain and Europe. And it continues to develop throughout the 19th century, competing with some other newer forms of entertainment as well during that time, but still becomes a very important form of public entertainment. Now, the 1900 Paris Universal Exposition really was the final development of the panorama as a public entertainment. The cinema would come along after that, and really people are going to be blown away by moving pictures, right? Why do you want to see a static picture when you can see a moving picture? So you can well understand. So really that was the end for the panorama. But in the Paris Universal Exposition, you see three sort of perfections of the panorama: the Trans-Siberian Railway, the Mariorama, and the Cinerama. The Trans-Siberian Railway was a huge panoramic display of views taken and constructed along the Trans-Siberian Railway. So very, very impressive, and sort of huge amount of moving parts to interchange scenes as you were there as well. So you start to see the influence of moving image in the panorama form. The Mariorama, again, Mariorama, I should say, another sort of vast, huge public display where you get to see movement integrated into the panorama form. So see the desire of audiences for moving images at this point. And the Cinerama, again, and I don't know if you can note at the bottom of that image what is going on there. Those aren't like cannons firing out or anything. Those are projections of images onto screens as well. So you start to see the development of cinema, not in moving image at this point, but as in the use of a number of images at different times in order to create the illusion of movement, which really is what cinema is. Actually, it's capture of stills which you move at a particular frame rate. But this isn't as sophisticated as that, but it's mirroring and anticipating a movement towards cinema. So the panorama ends at the point to which cinema is going to take over as the primary public entertainment for people. So the new century, the 20th century, that is, marked the end of the panorama, really. The loss of novelty and effect had been felt quite keenly at that point. Profits were down. People could now travel. You didn't need images of the world like the panorama because people were starting to travel. Now, they weren't traveling necessarily on planes at that point because the first manned flight had not yet taken place. But it was easier for people to travel around via railway and via, boat across oceans and so on. So there was less desire to actually see simulations of the world because you could see the world. You also had improved images of the world anyway, photographs in papers, and the development of cinema, which was just about to come, meant the view that the panorama gave was not going to be acceptable to audiences anymore. And sadly, many panoramas were left to deteriorate or fell victim to fire over time. So the physical architecture as well as the physical artifacts themselves were largely allowed to disintegrate, which is why the Mesdag panorama is interesting, because it was preserved and there are very few left from that time. So how do we understand the panorama? How do we even conceptualize how important what it was? Well, we can think of panoramas as a form of art and how they stood against art. There was obviously a long tradition of the ideal landscape in art, and landscape art has always been very, very popular. This was challenged in the 18th century by the notion of the picturesque, and the panorama went further than the picturesque. This like idealization of the landscape in the 18th century with the aim of complete realism, but in the process left art behind. It became corporate. So it raised the frame separating the space of the representation of the world from the real. And that becomes extremely important as we move forward. Indeed, one of the aims of cinema is to do that. And the aims of digital technologies today, like virtual reality, are to remove that separating space of the representation from the real. And that becomes a major problem in the 20th century and the 21st century theoretically. Indeed, the work of the eminent French sociologist Jean Baudrillard is all about how we consume the simulation of the real and we're never in contact with the real. And the panorama anticipates that sort of movement towards a dominance of the image in society. By erasing the perspectival window, we are consumed by the image itself and we are never in contact with the real. It also privileges the single point that enabled the observer to capture the view, and therefore privileges a sort of dominance over nature in itself. You know, that human beings can dominate nature, can capture it for their own ends from this privileged point of view that we have, which in itself is a very, very problematic ideological point which arose with the panorama. The point I was making about Jean Baudrillard is related to his theory of hyperrealism, with the aim of the panorama was to have total realism, which total realism means you erase the real in favor of the representation itself. You replace the real, or replace what the real is, and everything that exists is the experience of the media itself. The panorama represents then the first attempt to move beyond art into the realm of technical media simulation, and really this sort of forewarns us of problems we will have with the media in the 20th century and 21st century with regards to the simulation of the real being more important and more real to us than the real world itself. And if we live in a simulation, what is real? These problems are anticipated by the panorama in the 18th and 19th century. I mean, there were limits to the panorama, so there's a limit to the illusion, so it's not a complete sensory recreation. It's lacking, wind, sound, movement, passing of time, touch even. Most obviously in city scenes without people, or battle scenes without movement, for example. But it is an attempt, at least, to recreate, to trick the senses into believing we are in a different place and time. Most importantly, it's a commercial mass medium, so it moved away from art in being a business, and it was aimed at a mass audience. In France, you had 30 to 50,000 visitors a year, 200,000 a year in 72 to 85. So worked on an economy of scale, so there was a fixed cost and low entrance fee for large numbers of people. Starts to establish a business model for popular entertainment, which the cinema would largely take on board and copy. You build custom-built, environments for this. You charge people a fixed low entrance fee, so you get large numbers of people in, and you get a huge. So you also have to build on a big scale in order to get as many people in as cheaply as possible, because that's the best way of making money. All of that business model came from the panorama. So then the lessons learned from the panorama. So it becomes a very, very important precursor of the entertainments that we experience in the 20th century. And I guess we still have in the 21st century, although I'm talking in COVID times, and of course we haven't been to the cinema in ages. It was a democratized experience. You didn't need education. You didn't need aesthetic training. You didn't need knowledge of art or history to enjoy the panorama. It was an experience aimed at the lowest common denominator. I mean, everyone could enjoy it. Cinema would learn this lesson very, very quickly too. So there was a shift from elite cultural art to popular sensation-based entertainment. Taste, function, reference, meaning, all unimportant. You could just enjoy it as what it was. Public, cheap, accessible, dependent on simple pleasures and judgments. Huge change in public entertainment. A vast change to appeal to all, not just to certain sections of society. And this transformed the notion of what media could do in terms of being for all people and what kind of scope media could have. It was also, it could be criticized by the elites for realism and status, but it was defended by owners as an educational experience. It gave geographical or historical information to a large number of people. You could accompany the panorama by a guidebook or a lecture at the same time. Now, the appeal of it was still in the novelty of the spectacle of the real, but it did have educational purposes, and there was educational function underpinning what it did. We also have something in the panorama known as scopic control. The relationship to industrial revolution, the population movement, and urban growth meant that people didn't have access to the natural world anymore. So the panorama offered views of land and nature which were missing in urban life, and also the ability to perceive the scope of the city, which gives the individual significance and power within urban environments. The point I'm making here is that that kind of entertainment is still with us. You watch any Richard Attenborough documentary, David Attenborough, even ignore me, I'm Richard Attenborough, like film director. What am I talking about? You watch any David Attenborough documentary and you are still getting the same kind of thing. televisual entertainment designed to offer us views of land and nature that we would never experience ourselves in our lives. This is still a very, very popular form of popular entertainment, and the panorama is the first medium to popularize this kind of entertainment and to show the possibilities of showing the world in a particular way that will excite people in this way. Now, how did the bourgeoisie fit into this? Well, according to Ertemann and his work, which I'll put on Canvas and which is the recommended reading for this lecture, the symbolic form of the panorama was the symbolic form or expression of the bourgeoisie. It represented the bourgeoisie vision and nature of the world. Limitless perspective, a grasping of the whole, and most importantly, a control of the world. One of the key ideologies of the bourgeoisie is we can control everything. We can harness the world for our own needs. And the panorama as a viewpoint was an expression that, as a symbolic art form, the panorama showed that the world could be brought under control and exhibited in a particular way. So it reflects, the panorama, a new freedom and mastery of the world by the bourgeoisie. It is a classical bourgeoisie entertainment and medium. It also shows how the world, before the invention of photography, for example, how the world becomes as image, a mode of television, a key media technology in turning the world into an image to be appropriated and consumed, for images to become the key thing that we consume as media consumers, and how images of the world will come to replace experience of the world in the future. The panorama foreshadows all of this, and its popularity shows how images of the world can be a major motivating factor for audiences. This inspires theorists like Guy Debord when he's writing about the Society of the Spectacle in 1967. In societies where modern conditions of production prevail, the Industrial Revolution, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles, images. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. The images detached from every aspect of life fuse in a common stream in which the unity of this life can no longer be re-established. Reality considered partially unfolds in its own general unity as a pseudo-world apart, an object of mere contemplation. The spectacle in general, as the concrete inversion of life, is the autonomous movement of the non-living. What Debord means by all this is that images aren't real. Images don't live, but we consume them as if they are real life. And indeed, the panorama was consumed as if it was real, as if it was a reality in itself, as if it was real life, as if it was the real world. What Debord complains about here is that in societies such as our own, and at the time when he was writing as well, all we consume is images and we have no point of contact with the real itself. We just live in a pseudo world, and the autonomous movement of non-living, i.e. the image, is all that we actually get in terms of spectacle. The panorama is the beginning of this transformation of human experience to be in the human experience of the image and image alone. And we are left with the panorama today. If I had the facilities to do it, I'd now be showing you something in virtual reality and we'd be filing into the lab and all having a go at it. But the virtual reality headsets of today and what people are doing with virtual reality is really what people were doing with the panorama in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Nothing new exists in the world, my friends, and really the how virtual reality works is there. And within the panorama itself, we see the image and the dream of virtual reality in the virtual world, which we will all be coming to experience in the next few years. That, my friends, brings me to the end of what I want to discuss on the panorama in these videos. So, they're relatively short, but we will get into it in a big way in the seminars. Thank you very much.